Good morning, everyone. Happy Memorial Day weekend. Um, there's a lot going on today. If you look in your bulletins, we will not read through all this, but this is Memorial Day weekend. We'll remember what our soldiers did for us and their sacrifice for our country. Also, this is graduation Sunday, so during the morning service, we'll be recognizing and honoring those who are graduating from school. So that'll be going on today. That takes up the better part of our bulletin. But also, this is the last Sunday of the Sunday school quarter. Starting next Sunday, there will be a men's class and a women's class. Men's class, I believe, will be meeting here in the auditorium. Ladies, I assume your class is up in room 400 like before, I think. Maybe. If I'm wrong about that, somebody yell at me quick. Okay, we'll assume that's correct. So men's class and the ladies' class starting next week. And we will have different teachers come in and teach, kind of like we had before. And it'll be a good time. I believe the women's class is studying Fruit of the Spirit, if I'm not mistaken. And I think the guys' class will be down here going through something about trials or related to the book of Job, something like that. I know that's a horrible commercial, isn't it? Usually I read off the bulletin and let you know what it says. But I looked through the bulletin this morning, it's not there. So I'm having to go by memory. But I think that's it. But either way, come back. It'll be a great time, great summer. Get to hear from some other people, and we'll plan anyway to pick up the Old Testament survey in the fall quarter. But we're going to try to finish the book of Samuel this morning. If you want to turn to 2 Samuel chapter 1, because we're going to do our very, 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 very best to breeze through the entire book of what we call 2 Samuel this morning in one class. We're going to really keep going. We'll skim over some of the stories. Again, feel free to read those at home at your own convenience, because I know each of you have a copy of your own Bible that you can do that by yourself at home. The book of Samuel, again, like we said before, is talking about really outlining God's sovereignty in Israel's history, how he raises up and he puts down. And while the people that were living in the time only get what you might call the stadium view, they get to see the politics and the squabbles and the deceit and the betrayal and the murder and all the different things. When you read it in the Bible, of course, it kind of gives you a behind the stage, a backstage view of what's going on, how God is actually raising up and how God is actually taking down. And that in itself, I think, is not a bad lesson for us today, because we have the same stadium side view of our society, don't we? We see the election happening and this bill and this betrayal and that lie and that deception and this cover-up and all these different things. And yet, if God were to write a Bible book story about the U.S. of the 21st century, he'd probably include how God has taken care of this, and how God superintended that, and how it all comes together to accomplish whatever it is he wants to accomplish. The book of Samuel also shows us how God's law and his character plays out in real life in the messiness of the politics and the messiness of the wars and the desires and the lusts and the betrayals and all the different things that happen. And we see how that plays out as well. So we're going to continue the story this morning in 2 Samuel chapter 1. 2 Samuel chapter 1, Saul has just died. Saul has been chasing David for quite a while now. David's life has been at risk as long as Saul has been in power, because Saul's been jealous of David. He knows David will end up taking over. God has left David, and an evil spirit, the Bible says, has kind of taken over his mindset. And so he does some pretty erratic, some pretty irrational, some pretty vengeful, some pretty evil things, including trying to kill David multiple times, both with a spear when he's in his palace and then hunting him down in the wilderness. David has been on the run for a while with his band of men, running from town to town, hiding in the wilderness, hiding out with the Philistines of all things. He feels safer in Philistine territory than he does in his own nation, because his own king is hunting him. So he's hiding out with the Philistines for a while. But David hears about Saul's death, and somebody comes and brings him the message of Saul's death. And of course, the messenger thinks that he'll be rewarded, and David will be happy because now his enemy is dead. But the messenger doesn't get quite the reward that he's expecting, does he? He came and said, I got a message for you, David. And David said, what happened? And the messenger actually lies. He embellishes a little bit. He says, I was there when Saul was dying, and he knew the enemy was closing in, and so he said, here, come and kill me, because I don't want to, I've been wounded, and I'm not going to survive, but I just want to die quickly, not be tortured by the enemy. And so this guy says, this Amalekite messenger guy, he kind of embellishes his story and says, so I helped Saul out, and I helped run him through, and here's his stuff to prove that he's dead. And David looks at him and says, really, that's what happened? Yeah, that's what happened, says the messenger. David looks at him and says, really? Well, why were you not afraid to lift your hand against the Lord's anointed king? And I imagine that the messenger guy kind of stiffened up a little bit and said, whoa, this is not the response I was expecting. And David says, well, you said it with your own mouth. You just confessed. And so, Bubba, come over and kill the guy, because he murdered the Lord's anointed. And the messenger, who probably thought he was going to get a reward and some praise and all that kind of thing, ended up getting killed because David thought that he had murdered the Lord's anointed. And he writes a lament, a song of sadness for Saul and Jonathan. But David is anointed king of Judah then. You notice I just said Judah because the northern tribe, or the other tribes of Israel, they were still following Saul, and so the natural response is to have his son become king, and that's exactly what happened for the rest of the tribes. Judah and Benjamin followed David, and the other tribes followed Ishbosheth, who is Saul's son. And so you have kind of a power struggle going on. There are some fights going back and forth between the two. In fact, in chapter 3, verse 1, it says, there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David. It was not a smooth transition of power. And that comes along, I guess, anytime you have royalty and power and kingdoms and dynasties. There's always that power struggle. There's always, everybody wants the power. And so there's basically a civil war within Israel for a couple years between the house of Saul and the house of David. Chapter 3, verse 1. And David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul became weaker and weaker, just like what God said would happen. God said, Saul, I will take the dynasty away from you. I'll give it to somebody else. And that somebody else was David. Continuing on, verse 2. And sons were born to David at Hebron, which was the first capital of Judah. That's where he ruled for the first 7.5 years. His firstborn was Amnon. That was the son he had with Enoam of Jezreel. Second was Kileab, who he had with his other wife Abigail, the widow of Nabal. The third was Absalom, who he had with Maacah, the daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. The fourth was Adonijah, the son of Haggith. The fifth, Zephathiah, the son of Abital. The sixth, Ithream of Eglah, David's wife. All these six different sons, born with the 6 different wives. These were born to David in Hebron. There continues to be wars and betrayals back and forth. We're not going to spend a ton of time on this, but just reading the captions in my Bible here, we have the Joab murders Abner, the two commanders, I guess you'd say, of the northern and the southern tribes, and they're fighting against each other, and the one murders the other, which should not have been. David mourns Abner. Then finally Ishbosheth in chapter 4, the king of Israel, he is murdered as well. And again, a similar thing happens. Somebody comes and reports it to David, and he says, this is not right. And so the one that was suspected of murdering Saul's son is himself killed. But that kind of establishes David as the king, now that there is no more king of the other tribes of Israel. Chapter 5, David is anointed king of all the tribes. They all come together and say, look, now that we have no king, we need a king. David, he's a valiant guy. We will all kind of throw our head in and follow him for a while, make him king. Verse 4 of chapter 5, David was 30 years old when he began to reign. He reigned for 40 years. At Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months. And then later at Jerusalem, he reigned over all of Israel and Judah for another 33 years. He continues to have victory over his enemies. He continues to make certain treaties with people. Verse 11 of chapter 5, Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David, and cedar trees and carpenters and masons who built David a house. And I wanted to read that because that's going to come into play in another couple chapters here, where David builds himself a palace or a house with all the fancy materials, imported materials from Tyre. Verse 12, David knew that the Lord had established him king over Israel, and that he exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. And David took more concubines and wives from Jerusalem, and he came from Hebron, and more sons and daughters were born to David. He has a large family, building a large dynasty. And these are the names of those who were born to him in Jerusalem, and list off the names there. Among them are Nathan. Solomon as well is born there in Jerusalem. He goes to battle against the Philistines. God gives him victory there. And finally, David says it's time to bring the ark to Jerusalem. Chapter 6, verse 1, David gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000, and he rose and he went with all the people who were with him from Baal Judah to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord of hosts, who is enthroned on the cherubim. And they carried the ark of God on a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which is on the hill. And Uzzah and Ahio, the son of Amminadab, were driving the new cart with the ark of God, and Ahio went before the Lord. And it tells a story about how the ark is brought up out of this place. He's going to bring it into Jerusalem to be with himself, but something happens along the way. First of all, they put it on a cart to transport it. If your memory goes back that far, God said, when you transport my ark, it's to be carried on poles by the Levites. For whatever reason, I'm not sure why, they decided to do it the easy way and throw it on a cart. And along the way, the oxen stumbled. The cart maybe wasn't super stable, or maybe not as big as it should be, or they didn't have it strapped down, or whatever. I'm being a little facetious there. But the guy reaches out to stabilize it so it doesn't fall on the ground. And God says, you touch my ark, you're dead. And the guy died. And David looks at that. And it says here in this verse, or in this passage, that David was upset with God. Why? He was just trying to stabilize it. He said David was angry about that. But after that, David said, ooh, this is a little too much power. I'm not sure I want this close to me in Jerusalem, and so we're going to send it off to another guy's house. Poor guy, right? I don't want to die, and so I'm going to make you die. Send it to your house. So they sent it to the other guy's house, but it says God blessed him for having the ark and taking care of it. And apparently this guy whose house it was at, he really honored it. He treated it well. He reverenced it, all those things. And so said God blessed him for the few months that it was there. David looked at that and said, maybe I want some of that blessing. I think I changed my mind. I want it with me after all. And so they go to this guy's house and they bring it up to Jerusalem, and there's great fanfare. So much so that says David took off his outer royal garments, and he was dancing with the people in the streets, and it's a great big celebration as the ark of God is triumphantly brought into Jerusalem, the capital of Israel. Michal, who is David's wife, the daughter of Saul, which has another story in chapter 3, if you remember. Saul had promised David Michal his daughter, but after things soured between them, he said, never mind, I'm going to give my daughter to this other guy after all instead. So they gave David's wife to the other guy. But in chapter 3, as part of the agreement of... Do I even want to tell this whole story? It sounds like soap opera, doesn't it? But just to give you the kind of messy stuff that was going on, commander of the Northern Tribes army, the Israel army, he said, David, I will come to you. David says, fine, but as part of the agreement, I want my wife back. So you go get Michal, the wife that I was promised earlier, and bring her with me. And if you don't bring her with you when you come to me. If you don't bring her, I don't want to see you. So the guy goes and he grabs the wife and he takes her away. Well, the wife has another husband at this point. They've been married for however many years. And so the other husband, who is now having his wife stolen away so she can go back to David, who already has over half a dozen wives himself, he's following along saying, come back, I don't want to lose you. Come back, I don't want to lose you. And the commander, who is doing the stealing of the wife, finally looks at the other husband and says, go home, you're not going to win this one. And he realizes he's not going to win, and he has to go home wifeless. And Michal, who has now been taken from husband A, now goes back to David to be his wife. Kind of I'm not sure about that kind of story. But anyway, so Michal's looking down at David in chapter 6, who's just celebrating his heart out as the ark of God comes into town, and she says, this is not kingly behavior for you. Why stop humiliating yourself like this? Act more like a king. Be dignified. Stop dancing around with the commoners as the ark is coming into Jerusalem. And David says, I'm going to absolutely continue to celebrate this because I'm excited to see God coming back into our city. And if you think this is embarrassing, then essentially tough luck is what he said to her. I'm going to keep on doing it. And because of this, God says, Michal, you are going to be childless and you will never have a child. And sure enough, she never did. She was barren the rest of her life, which also goes to complete what God said earlier about Saul. Saul, I'm going to cut off your name from the power structure of Israel. And so if she'd have had a son, that would have been a potential line to the throne. And so that also fulfills that promise. Fun how it all comes together, isn't it? Isn't that amazing? But in chapter 7, this is really probably the most important chapter that I want to focus on this morning. God looks at all this, and David is established in Jerusalem. He's now king. He has a firm grip on the power structure in Israel. God has established him there. In chapter 7, verse 1, it says, we see, well, here, let's do it this way. The first several chapters of 2 Samuel that we just covered involve God establishing David as king. He becomes king over the tribe of Judah. He gains victory over Saul's lingering dynasty and was established as king of all Israel, and he began to have victory over the Philistines. Finally, when David was settled in Jerusalem, he began to want to show his gratefulness to God in a very special way. And David always recognizes that he owes where he is to what God has done for him. And so in chapter 7, verse 1, he says, now when the king of Israel, when the king, David, lived in his house that he just built back in chapter 5, and the Lord had given him rest from all of his surrounding enemies, the king said to Nathan the prophet, see now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells in a tent. And Nathan said to the king, do all that is in your heart, for the Lord is with you. David's looking around, he's established, he's comfortable, he's living in Jerusalem, a well-fortified city. He's living in this house that he's built with imported materials. And maybe he looks out the window, or maybe he has just visited the ark recently or something, but it brings it to mind. He says, something's not right here. He says, I'm living in this fancy house. I'm the king. But the God that we worship, the God who made me king and gave me my prosperity and gave me my victory, he's living in a tent on the other side of town. He says, this isn't right. I need to do something to honor God now. He's established me. I want to make sure that he is established and recognized for the great God that he is. I need to build him a house. And so he calls in his prophet, Nathan. He says, Nathan, I think I need to build God a house and honor him in that way. What do you think? And at first, Nathan's first response is, well, yeah, sure, God's with you. You do whatever you want. This sounds like a great plan. I think it's a good idea. Go for it. God is with you. But in verse 4, it says, that same night, the word of the Lord came to Nathan and said, I think you got it wrong, Nathan, the first time. Go tell my servant David, thus says the Lord, would you build me a house to dwell in? I have not lived in a house since the day I brought up the people of Israel from Egypt unto this day, and I've been moving about in a tent for my dwelling. In all the places where I have moved with all the people of Israel, did I speak a word with any of the judges of Israel, whom I commanded to shepherd my people of Israel, saying, why have you not built me a house of cedar? God says, I've lived in a tent ever since we came out of Egypt. I gave you instructions. I gave Moses instructions on what tent to build, how to build it, what to make it out of, the whole tabernacle thing. I gave all those instructions. I've been satisfied there. And even when I appointed judges to lead my people, did I ever have one of my judges build me a fancy house to live in? Rhetorical question. The answer is no, he did not. And so while David says, I want to build God a house, God says, this has always been my house, the town that I've lived in. But he continues on and he turns the conversation around a little bit. And he makes another proclamation or statement to David. He says, now therefore, God continues in his message, he says, now therefore, thus you shall say to my servant David, thus says the Lord of hosts. He says, I took you from the pasture, from following the sheep, that you should be prince over my people Israel. And I've been with you wherever you went, and have cut off all your enemies from before you. And I will make you a great name, like the name of the great ones of the earth. And I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them so that they may dwell in their own place and be disturbed no more. And violent men shall afflict them no more as formerly, from the time that I appointed judges over all my people Israel. And I will give you rest from all your enemies. Moreover, the Lord declares to you that the Lord will make you a house. When your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. And when he commits iniquity, I will discipline him with the rod of men, with the stripes of the Son of Men. But my steadfast love will not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, whom I put away from before you. And your house and your kingdom shall be made sure forever before me. Your throne shall be established forever. David says, I want to build God a house. I want to honor him in this way. God says, I don't need a house. If I needed a house, I would have asked for one earlier. But instead, David, I want to build you a house. You're not going to build me a house. And later on, we see that a house is built, but that will happen later on in Solomon's time. But God says, you're not going to build me a house. I'm going to build you a house. But the house that God wants to build for David isn't talking about timbers and stones and shingles and windows and stuff like that, is it? It's talking about what? A dynasty, a lineage, a name, an everlasting presence in the ruling family of Israel. God says, I want to give you this. I want to build you an everlasting ruling structure in the house of Israel as my chosen king. I want to do this for you. And he lists a whole bunch of promises and descriptions of what this house is to be like. In fact, let's look through a couple of these here, where God says, I will build you a kingly house and a dynasty and a lineage that will go on forever. But take a look at some of these, because I think there's a little bit of dual meaning here, and I'll show you what I mean. Verse 10 says, I will appoint a place for my people Israel, and will plant them, so that they may dwell in their own place, and to be disturbed no more. And violent men shall afflict them no more as formerly, from the time that I appointed judges over my people Israel. So right away we see, I will provide a place for my people, and they will no longer be disturbed. People will not bother them anymore. Was that fulfilled under Solomon? Because Solomon, of course, looking ahead, we know, was David's son who would be the next king, and then there were more kings after that of David's line. Was there peace and prosperity under Solomon, so much so that no one ever disturbed them ever again? The answer is, I told you before about the thumb vote, right? This up is yes and down is no. Do we need to take a thumb vote here? Was this promise fulfilled the way that God said under Solomon? We have to go kind of a solid, kind of halfway, wasn't it? Peace and prosperity under Solomon did indeed happen. They had so much peace and so much prosperity, and you can read about this in Kings and other places. They were so wealthy under Solomon. It said that silver had little value. They kind of threw it out. Everything was gold. Massive amounts of riches and wealth came into the city. But also, God gave them peace on every side. There was very little war, at least earlier on in the reign of Solomon. Later on, God kind of started bringing some judgments on Solomon. But for much of the reign of Solomon, there was very much peace, wasn't there? So was the promise fulfilled? It was, until we get to the part where they said, what? They will never be disturbed again. Because were they ever disturbed again? If you know anything about Bible history, you know, yes, absolutely they were disturbed. Multiple times, up to and including when they had to be exiled from the land, and then came back, and then there's the intertestamental period when they were constantly at war, constantly getting beat up. They were exiled again, and you can look over at Israel now, and still they were being disturbed all the time. So yes, God gave them peace under Solomon, but that was only a partial fulfillment, wasn't there? And so we know that sometime, ultimately, one of David's seed will have to reign in perfect peace forever and ever. If that does not happen, God's promise is null, void, and doesn't become fulfilled. So there has to be at some point one of David's lineage that reigns forever and ever and will never be disturbed again. How about verse 11 here, continuing on? From the time that I appointed judges over my people Israel, and I will give you rest from all your enemies. Was that fulfilled under Solomon? Yes, partially, wasn't it? He had a very, very peaceful and prosperous reign, like we just said. Was it real peace? Was it genuine peace? Was it a permanent peace? Was it a temporary peace? It was a peace that lasted long enough until God decided to kind of bring some judgment upon the people, and the people who were subjugated under David started to realize maybe we can start to fight back a little again. And sure enough, peace was temporary, short-lived, and only very, very conditional. But it says here in this passage that true and lasting peace would happen to David's seed during their reign. So somewhere along the line, there has to be another reign where God will give rest permanently and in a real way from all of Israel's enemies. Verse 12, when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish his throne forever. I will raise up one of yours, and he will reign forever and ever, your offspring who will follow you. Again, did that happen during David's son and grandson and great-grandson? Did he have a lineage of rulers that came after him? Everybody go, yes, he did. Their names were Solomon, they were Rehoboam, Abijah, Asa, Jehoshaphat, and on down the line. We could continue. Did they reign forever? Who's the king of Israel today? They don't even have a king today, do they? They have a prime minister or whatever you call him over there. Yeah. So they reigned for a few centuries, and they were exiled, and they came back, and they kind of had a ruler, but not really, because they were always under the thumb of somebody else. And then they were exiled again, and they weren't even a nation for 1900 years. So they reigned for a while so far, but to call that an eternal reign is a bit of a stretch. But for this promise to be fulfilled, what has to still happen? Someday, a descendant of David has to reign forever and ever. Continuing on, what about verse 13? He shall build a house for my name, I'll establish his kingdom forever and ever. He will build a house for my name. Did David's son build a house for God's name? Yeah, he did. The first temple, gorgeous place. Boy, of all the places of antiquity, if you could go back in time and look at, that's one I'd like to see. Not, being a Gentile, I couldn't go in there anyway. But it'd still be neat to have some kind of video footage or something of that place. Gold-lined everything, magnificent, beautiful stuff. And then at the dedication, God comes down and his presence is there, so much so the priest can't even go in. Really amazing. So he did indeed build a house for God's name. The physical kind of house. But what about the everlasting dynasty meaning of the house that God puts into context here? Kind of. But there has to be another ruler who actually does this forever and ever. What about verse 14? I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. What about that one? Did David and his son Solomon and his son Rehoboam and on down the line, did they ever have a true father-son relationship with God Almighty? If you have to be honest about it, it was really kind of more like a servant-master relationship, wasn't it? David honored God, he worshiped him, he was after his own heart, but I don't remember passages where he says he's like my father, and God says he's like my son. But somewhere, one of David's descendants has to have that true father-son relationship. Somewhere along the line. Where would that ever happen? How could that ever happen? Has it ever happened? I can only think of one person maybe who could say, he is my father, and God says, he is my son. Listen to him. In him I am well pleased. There's something going on here more than just Solomon and Rehoboam in that line. There's some greater fulfillment than the immediate. There has to be an ultimate fulfillment that is yet to come. Who could that be talking about? Who could that be talking about? We know him by name, don't we, from our perspective today. But from David's perspective, or from the Old Testament perspective, who is this talking about? Put this in context of what we've studied so far. Who is this? This is, I'm looking at that's who this is, Most of the time, things work out really well in PowerPoint. Every now and then, some kind of formatting glitch happens. I apologize for this. It is not supposed to say the, because that's not very informative. Who is this? You know who this is. This is the Messiah. This is the seed that was to come. Now, it's been a while since we've looked at the seed who was to come. We've almost put him out of our minds for a while. It's been so long. We've been so involved with the judges and the stories and everything that's happened in Samuel and Ruth and all that stuff. But there's a promise that we maybe should revisit at this point, isn't there? Does this one look familiar to anybody? We hit this one pretty hard for quite a while, but we've almost forgotten about it. It's been so long. The land, the nation, and the seed. And this is the promise that God gave to Abraham back in Genesis chapter 12. The land part of the promise was fulfilled in the book of, read the screen, Joshua. When they went in, they conquered the land. God gave them the land just like he said he would. They became a nation in the books of Exodus and Deuteronomy. Very good. Exodus, because they came out, they became an individual people, and they were established as a national identity with the book of Deuteronomy, where God says, here's who you are. You are a group. You are my people. I am your king. You are my subjects. Here's the treaty between the two of us. And with that, they kind of solidified. They kind of stopped being just a people group, and they became a nation as they went into their land. But the seed part of it, for so long, we've kind of had to put question marks after this because we didn't really know too much about it. We had some clues, didn't we? We had some clues about who he could have been throughout the book of Genesis, but we had to put question marks. But now we can put more than just question marks because we have some more information, don't we? Who is this seed going to be that will be the ultimate fulfillment of what God says in chapter 7? Who's he going to be? He's going to be a son of David. This is another clue. This is so exciting. It's been so long since we've had any more information, since God tells us something more about this ultimate promise that he has made. In fact, if you remember back in Genesis, we kind of made a chart of all the different promises that we were accumulating, and it looked like that. Chapter 3, God promised Adam and Eve a seed that would fix this sin problem that they created by disobeying God and got kicked out of the garden. But God says, someday I will send somebody who will crush that serpent's head and he'll set everything right again. Chapter 12, the promise that we just looked at, God told Abraham, I will promise you that through your family all nations of the earth will be blessed, talking about the seed. Chapter 15, again through Abram's offspring. Chapter 17, specifically through Isaac. Chapter 49, of the tribe of Judah. And then things kind of went radio silence for a while, didn't they? We didn't hear anything more about the ultimate seed to come. But now, all of a sudden, during the time of David, God makes this promise to David in chapter 7, and we get to add another layer on top. And what is that layer? What's that refinement of the promise? We know that the ultimate seed, the ultimate Messiah will come through the line of David. He'll be a son of David. That is so exciting. And God has not forgotten his promise. That's the best part of all. I mean, we knew he didn't, but it's so nice to hear another update about who he's going to be someday. He's going to be of the ruling family from Judah of the son of David. All right, continuing on. The rest of this particular section, chapter 1 through 20 of 2 Samuel, contains other story that further display God's sovereignty in the life of David. Again, we do not have time to go through all these stories. Read them on your own. But it talks about God's sovereignty in the life of David, his victory over his enemies in chapters 8 through 10, his punishments for sin in chapter 12, his victory over Absalom in chapter 17. Just to skim through a couple of those, David has more military victories with his enemies. He shows kindness in chapter 9 to a son of David. If you remember, he made a promise to Saul's son Jonathan. He said, I will show, because of you and our friendship, I make a vow to you that I will show kindness to you and your descendants. In some way, somehow, I will show kindness. And that was a big deal because back then, when one king takes over from another king, usually what you do is you what? Kill off all the remnants of the other king's family so they're no longer a political threat. In fact, that kind of happened when David first became power, wasn't it? Saul's family wanted to maintain power. In fact, we see that later on in the book again. But David says, because of my kindness to you, or because of our relationship with you, Jonathan, I will show kindness to one of your relatives, your offspring. And so that's exactly what happened. He picks this lame kid who couldn't even walk. David is established. He says, who is there left of of Saul's house, of Jonathan's descendants, that I can show kindness to. And he brings this guy into his house, and he feeds him, he takes care of him, he treats him really, really well, and he keeps his word in that way. We also see a lot of other things going on. David defeats other military enemies in chapter 10. Then we get to chapter 11. Chapter 11 is David's other famous story. This is a rough one. Again, we were not going to read it all, but David looks down as his army is off to war, and he sees a gorgeous thing taking a bath on the rooftops below. And he says, I think I want her. And so he brings her in, and he sleeps with her. She is pregnant. She sends him a little sticky note that says, by the way, David, after our thing the other night, you should probably know that I'm pregnant. David breaks out in a cold sweat, and he says, this is really, really, really bad, because the husband is one of the generals fighting off in the army that David himself probably should have been with. So he calls him back and says, Uriah, give me your report. How's the battle going? He says, oh, really, really great. Oh, good to hear. Why don't you take a couple days rest, and you can head back out to the battlefield. Go on home and, relax, put up your feet, and have some fun with your wife, and you can go back to the battlefield. Well, he doesn't do it. He sleeps in the temple. David calls him back. Why didn't you go home? Why is that so important? Well, because you deserve some rest and relaxation. How can I do that when all my men are on the battlefield? So he sends him back. But before he sends him back to the battlefield, he gives him a little note, doesn't he? He says, give this to the commanding officer. And the note says, send Uriah and his men up to the front lines. Send him way too close to the city so that he's within range of the enemy arrows. Then withdraw all your support so that Uriah is killed. And Uriah has to deliver his own death sentence to his own army. Well, they follow the orders, and they withdraw, and Uriah is killed by the enemy. And the word comes back to David about the weekly update or whatever of the battle. And the messenger who delivers is given the instructions. Take the message to David about the battle, including our defeat at this one city. And if David gets upset, he says, why, you know better than this. Why were you so close to the city? Don't you remember, how dangerous that is? Don't you remember the story about the guy getting in the millstone dropped on his head? What are you doing? I'm really upset about this. Also include, say, by the way, Uriah, your servant, is dead. And so the messenger comes back and they tell David, and David's response in normal times would have been, how could you do such a silly military thing? You know better than this. Heads are going to roll for this. Instead, David hears the note about Uriah being dead, and he kind of shrugs his shoulders and says, you win some and you lose some. Yeah, I guess these things happen. Carry on. Best of luck to you. And David's plan is complete. Well, it's not as complete as he thinks, because he gets a visit from Nathan the prophet, doesn't he? And he gives him the story about the guy who steals another guy's sheep. And David looks at him and he says, this guy ought to die. How can he dare do this? And Nathan points his finger back at him and he says, you are that guy, because you did this. You did the same exact thing. Chapter 12, verse 7, Nathan said to David, you are the man. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you out of the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your arms, and gave you the house of Israel and Judah. And if this were too little, I would add to you as much more. Why have you despised the word of the Lord to do what is evil in his sight? You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with a sword, and have taken his wife to be your wife, and have killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Now therefore, the sword shall never depart from your house, because you have despised me, and have taken the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your wife. Thus says the Lord, behold, I will raise up evil against you out of your own house, and I will take your wives from before your eyes, and give them to your neighbor, and he shall lie with your wives in the sight of the sun. In other words, in broad daylight, in public display. For you did it secretly, but I will do this thing before all Israel and before the sun. David said to Nathan, I've sinned against the Lord. And David said to David, the Lord has also put away your sin. You shall not die. Nevertheless, because by this deed you have utterly scorned the Lord, the child who is born to you shall die. Then Nathan went to his house. This, I think, is kind of a turning point in the book of Samuel. Everything from here on out just kind of starts falling apart, and it gets ugly and gritty. First of all, the child dies in chapter 12, and David mourns him. Rabbah is captured. military problems going on. In chapter 13, you have incest and rape going on between the brother and sister of David, and that causes yet more division and conflict within the family, which is exactly what God said would happen in his family. The last part of chapter 13, you have brother murdering another brother in retaliation for the rape that happened earlier. One brother decides to kill the other brother. Absalom murders Amnon. Absalom has to flee away. He's exiled for a while, but then he ends up returning to Jerusalem. David kind of pardons Absalom, probably in a way that he should not have, but he kind of overlooks and excuses this behavior among his children. Now that Absalom has gained access back to Jerusalem, he starts to try to turn the people away from David, his father, and gain a following for himself so he himself can usurp the throne. There's an all-scale, full-out attack on David and his authority. David has to flee out of Jerusalem, being attacked by his own son. He's mocked and scorned and abused along the way. Absalom comes in. He tries to take over the kingdom. In fact, there's a council there that goes on. Many of David's followers defect to Absalom, making the problem that much worse. David comes very, very close to losing the kingdom altogether. Verse 20 of chapter 16, Absalom says to Ahithophel, "Give your counsel, what should we do?" Ahithophel, the advisor, says to Absalom, "Go to your father's concubines, whom he has left to keep the house, and all Israel will hear that you have made yourself a stench to your father, and the hands of all who are with you will be strengthened." In other words, do something that will show all of Israel that you are now king, that you've taken over. And so here's what you do. The 10 concubines that David left to take care of the palace, you go in broad daylight in full view of all of Israel, and you sleep with them. Say, what used to be David's is now mine. I am now the king. That's what this means. Verse 22, so they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof where everybody can see. And Absalom went into his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. What did we just say back in chapter 11 and 12? What you have done in secret, God will do to you in full daylight, broad spectrum, full view of everyone. What just happened? Exactly that thing. God's taking up, God is putting down, God's pronouncing judgments. He's in control of it all. Verse 23, now in those days the counsel that Ahithophel gave was if one consulted the word of God. So was all the counsel of Ahithophel esteemed, both by David and Absalom. We don't know much about Ahithophel other than this little blurb here. But wouldn't you love to know Ahithophel? He was so wise, so intelligent, so informed, so intuitive. It said asking his advice was almost like asking advice of God himself. So good was his advice. But he's defected now to Absalom. And so he's now advising Absalom. So David sends in one of his friends, Hushai. And he goes in and he's able to subvert the good counsel of Ahithophel and replace it with bad counsel. So David's not wiped out. He has time to recoup. There's a battle that goes on. Absalom is killed. But instead of rejoicing again, David mourns Absalom's death, so much so that the soldiers, his own soldiers who fought for him, are discouraged. Did we win the victory or did we lose? We just killed him and saved your life. Why are you mourning his loss? Mess after mess after mess after mess after the whole Bathsheba thing. Just like God said, the conflict never ends and the turmoil in David's family never stops, just like God said. Does this sound almost like a real-life playing out of Hannah's prayer back in chapter 2? God is raising up, God is putting down, God is sending turmoil, God is sending deliverance, God is sending victory, God is sending deceit. His hands is in it all. Does that mean that the people who did wrong are absolved from their responsibility of doing wrong? Not at all. The wrong was still wrong. Does that mean that God is sovereign enough to use their wrong to accomplish his purpose? Yes, absolutely it does, and that's what's going on throughout this book. So that's what this book does. But it also, as we said, it allows us to spend time with David, the man after God's own heart. We see how he deals with Mephibosheth in a very good way. We see how he deals with Bathsheba and Uriah in a very, very bad way. We see how he responds to Nathan when Nathan points his finger and he repents. We see how he deals with Absalom when he's under threat and under attack, and also when he's murdered his brother and doesn't really stop the bad behavior the way he should have. We see how he responds to Barzillai, which is a minor character, but he shows his faithfulness to David, and David offers him a place to come into Jerusalem, and he says, look, I'm an old guy, I'm over 80 years old. there's not much left of my life. I'm just glad to see that God's man is put back in power. And we see how he deals with Ziba, who is actually Mephibosheth's servant, who double crosses apparently Mephibosheth. He comes out to support David supposedly, but portrays Mephibosheth as a traitor, so that David says, fine, everything that he has is now yours. And so he gives all Mephibosheth's stuff to Ziba. Then they go back into Jerusalem. David looks at Mephibosheth and says, why did you abandon me? And he says, I didn't abandon you. I'm lame. I can't hop on a donkey and go away. Ziba, my guy, he took all the donkeys, he packed up and left, and I couldn't get out. And he says, really? Well, that's not very nice. And so he just kind of in the end says, well, you got to split the territory. Half the stuff goes to you and half the stuff goes to you. And that's all he does. Lots of ups and lots of downs, lots of turmoil, lots of confusion, lots of betrayal, lots of infighting, all kinds of things. All this goes downhill after God's judgment on David. So what can we learn from David in all these chapters? What does God see in him, David, that makes him so special, though? God never abandons David like he did Saul, even despite of all the mess that he causes. What is that makes him the man after God's own heart? The last couple chapters that we really don't have time to look at. This section of 2 Samuel includes various stories and information from David's life. Chapter 22 is a song of praise to God after God gave him victory over Saul and his other enemies. He praises God for his protection, his strength, his faithfulness, and his sovereignty. It's the gratitude of a person who has experienced the sovereignty of God that we've heard about from Hannah's prayer so many years ago. In fact, it's such a good song that the Bible records it again, word for word, in what we know as Psalm 18. This psalm is recorded twice in the Bible. It records it here first in the book of 2 Samuel, chapter 22, when David sings it to God about his deliverance from Saul, and it records it again in chapter 18 of Psalms, pretty much word for word. I thought that was really neat, but it records it twice. The final story of 2 Samuel is about David taking a census of the fighting men. How does this demonstrate God's sovereignty? Well, the plague stopped when an angel reached the threshing floor of Araunah. David bought the place to offer sacrifice. God gave him a choice. What kind of judgment do you want? God says, I don't want to be in the hands of men. I want to fall into your hands. Give me 3 days of plague and pestilence on the land. So God just starts killing people. 70,000 people died. And God says David could see the death angel coming towards Jerusalem, so he runs out to this place. And he buys this place and he offers a sacrifice to stop it. David bought the place to offer a sacrifice. It was located in this threshing floor, but this threshing floor of Araunah was located on a place that's called Mount Moriah, according to what we can tell, which is the same place where Abraham was about to offer Isaac as a sacrifice. I thought that's fascinating. But later, Solomon would also use this very same piece of land to construct the temple. The temple, the same place where Abraham almost offered Isaac, the same place where God stopped the plague and where David bought this piece of land to offer sacrifice to him. And God's house would be built by David's son, again, just as he promised. So the whole book of Samuel, really, we can kind of see this overall theme, can't we? Start out with Hannah's prayer, acknowledging God's sovereignty. We see throughout the book countless examples of God's guidance and direction and care through Samuel, through the lives of Saul, and then the life of David. And finally, it bookends at the end of the book with David's gratefulness for God's sovereignty, both in his song, again ending with another song in chapter 22, and recognition of the full circle and what God would do on this little piece of land at the end of the book. Bookended with statements and praise of God's sovereignty, and in the middle, stories throughout of how God's will plays out in the national story of Israel. That's the book of Samuel. We have to take a rest break for a quarter, and we will get back to this. Let's see, the next book in line is Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 2 Samuel. Next we go to the book of... Sorry, another distortion. I do not know why I did that. Job? That's not right. It must be another mistake. Well, again, our Bibles are not aligned in chronological order. The next book, the book of Kings, wasn't written for quite some time after that. So I want to try as best as I can to cover them in the order they were written so we can see how they fit together better. And chronologically next, we get to the wisdom literature writing. So Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, we're going to cover those books next quarter. Now I say Job with question mark because I think during the next quarter, the guys' class will be all about the book of Job. So I'm not sure I want to dive right back into Job after a full quarter of Job. So maybe we'll do Psalms, Proverbs, and the rest of them, then come back to Job. But we will hit Job at some point, and I'll just see how this next quarter plays out and if I want to hit it right away or later on. But yes, we will not go to Kings next. We'll hit the wisdom literature next because they were mostly, kind of for the most part, we think, written around the time of David and Solomon. And we will go into that detail when we cover it. So let's pray and we'll dismiss. Dear God, we thank you this morning for giving us all these books, even the disturbing, gritty stories, the sad stories at the end of the book of Samuel, and all the good stories that came before that. But we can see your hand and your sovereignty throughout it all. And while that doesn't cancel our responsibility to do what's right for you, we do know that you're in charge, even when it doesn't sometimes look like it. So we thank you for all these stories. We can see how you relate to the people.